Hi there, and welcome to my introduction to the extended mind. I'm Dr. Karen Caldwell. Please call me Karen. In this video, we're going to return to the two ways that all humans learn before we launch into the three cognitions of the extended mind. At the end of the video, I want to share my enormous excitement about where I feel we stand today, and that's this frontier of convergence. And I'll close by recommending two books and sharing my references. So as you watch the video, I want you to be active and remove your phone physically and ideally even turn it off or at least put it on silent. I also encourage you to take notes by hand and add drawings to those notes, and they could be symbols, images, sketches, anything that helps you to make sense of what you learned today. Finally, I want you to pause and generate your answers to questions that I pose, and do so in writing or orally rather than just conjuring them in your mind. So let's start with one pause, and that's to pause and retrieve. And there you see my dog, Willie, who's part Labrador Retriever. And Willie wants you to answer these two questions and to retrieve them from your memory. What are the two ways that humans learn? And of those two ways, how do they change across the lifespan? So press pause, and when you're ready, press play. All right, let's start with that first question. What are the two ways that humans learn? Well, I'm hoping this metaphor of the iceberg is helpful. And above the surface, of course, we have conscious learning. Below the surface, we have subconscious learning. And Geary would call the above the surface learning, and in fact the knowledge itself, as biologically secondary. And that's because we're not hardwired to acquire it. Below the surface, Geary would call this biologically primary, because we truly are primed or hardwired to acquire it throughout our lifespan. So speaking of our lifespan, let's look at how these change, these two ways of learning, how they change across the lifespan. So we have in our initial years, about the first 5 years, a subconscious way of acquiring knowledge and skills. At age 5, though, this shifts into a more conscious way of learning, and that continues across the lifespan. So I'd like to look and return to a couple of key points about subconscious and conscious learning, and just remind you about the way that when we learn subconsciously, it's largely without conscious effort. And that's because it's intuitive, and we acquire knowledge and skills naturally simply through our interaction in our environments. And examples of this are speaking, walking, and even being able to recognize faces. We acquire that naturally and without conscious effort. Conscious learning, of course, requires attention and focus, and therefore it feels slow and effortful. And it also requires deliberate practice. But the problem that you see on the screen is that these two circles of concepts are separate. But we know that they're not entirely separate. It's not a binary set of understanding or concepts, sorry. So subconscious and conscious learning simply does not exist in isolation. And this is where the extended mind helps us to go beyond this binary way of looking at learning. And the extended mind begins with the question, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? Keep in mind that biologically primary knowledge or subconscious learning happens subconsciously based on our engagement in the environment. So pause and think about this question deeply. And you see in this image here a globe outside of the human's body, but also you see the human hand, so there may be some kind of connection here. So press pause to think about your answer to this question, and when you're ready, press play. All right, so typically, if you are from a Western culture, you have a brain-bound way of answering this question. And Annie Murphy-Paul explains that our culture insists that the brain is the locus of learning. And she explains in this vivid way that as the locus of thinking, it's a cordoned off space where cognition happens, much as the workings of my laptop are sealed inside its aluminum case. So that feels rather scientific and positivist, right? And we also use language that reflects this way of thinking about learning. Expressions like use your head, or we do math problems in our heads. And I want you to pause and think about how you envision thinking and learning, and also where it happens. And it may be helpful to think about the language and the metaphors that you use as you think about how we learn. When you're ready, I'm going to share the expressions that I typically have used in my lifetime when I talked about thinking and learning. So press pause, and then when you're ready, of course, press play. All right, so there are 3 expressions, and you see that I'm asking you to pause and to fill in the blank. These expressions are, I'd like to pick your blank, put on your thinking blank, and blank storm some ideas. So just take a moment to finish those expressions, and when you're ready, press play. All right, so these are, as I said, 3 expressions that I use a lot, starting with, I'd like to pick your brain. I also often say, let's put on our thinking caps. And of course, caps cover our skull. And finally, we tend to brainstorm ideas when we're trying to come up with items from our long-term memory and ideas that we want to create. So we recognize that subconscious and conscious learning has this enormous overlap, and the extended mind helps us to understand where this overlap happens. We also have Western and Indigenous ways of knowing, and that too is being brought together, and we're seeing this convergence of ways of knowing and perspectives through the extended mind. So with Western ways of knowing, Clark and Chalmers, who are the philosophers who first brought us this theory of the extended mind, they explain that our way of separating the mind and the body and the environment is not tenable, it's not accurate. And they say that it's an unprincipled distinction that we make. And Indigenous folks across millennia have always known that all beings and the land are connected and rely on one another and work in balance. So with the extended mind, we have this way of looking at embodied cognition, situated cognition, and distributed cognition. And what you see on the right here is you, the learner, the individual, in a human body. But you don't just learn in isolation. You learn in situated ways. And these environments are either built or natural. A classroom, for example, is a built environment, or taking a walk in the woods would be engaging in our natural environments. We also distribute our cognition when we work with others. And that's this notion of distributed cognition, interacting and collaborating with others in these reciprocal ways. So let's start and go a bit deeper with embodied cognition. Embodied cognition is learning through our senses and our movement, including gesture. And it's not just learning. We form memories, and we also communicate our own understanding in the same way through movement and gesture. And the next one is situated cognition, where we are physically situated. And situated cognition helps us to understand the influence of place in our thinking. And that place is represented in the physical world of spaces. And those are natural spaces, built spaces, and the spaces of ideas. And that last concept comes from Turner and colleagues, and I'll share that reference and recommend their book at the end. But an example of the space of ideas is when we're in a classroom, we might use the chalkboard, for example, as a space where we can physically represent our ideas, even in spatial ways. And that's another reason why I encourage you to add drawings to your notes, because it helps you to recognize the spatial or relational way that our ideas are connected. All right, finally, we have distributed cognition, and that's learning from and with others in reciprocal ways. And learning truly is deeper when it results from collaborative efforts, and it really does exceed our individual efforts for learning. All right, so those are the 3 cognitions, and I want to return to good old Willie Boy and ask you to retrieve from your memory which cognition relates to learning through our senses and our movement, including gesture. So try to retrieve that not from your notes, but from your memory. And when you're ready, press play and you can check your answer. All right, well, if you guessed embodied cognition, you were right. And I used the mnemonic of body in the middle to remember this meaning of embodied cognition. All right, let's try another one. Pause and retrieve the answer to this question, which is, which cognition relates to learning through collaborative reciprocal efforts with others? This one's likely a little more difficult. So pause and spend some itchy brain moments trying to retrieve this information from your memory and not from your notes. And when you're ready, press play. All right, so this kind of cognition is distributed. And I try to think about distributing my thinking and my problem solving with friends and colleagues that I rely on and with whom I have this reciprocal relationship so that we can solve problems together or build a deeper understanding. And that enhances my own individual efforts. Okay, the final pause and retrieve question is a bit tougher because it's not asking you to find the concept itself, but to find the meaning of the concept in your memory banks. So what does situated cognition mean? What does it emphasize in learning? So pause and try to retrieve that answer, and when you're ready, press play. So situated, hopefully that word situated reminds you of place and location. And so situated cognition is the influence of place in learning and thinking. And that involves natural spaces, built spaces, and our space of ideas. All right. So Western and Indigenous ways of knowing are also captured in the extended mind. And we know that there is this enormous overlap. So next, I'd like to demonstrate where that overlap lies vis-a-vis those three cognitions. And in this table, you have embodied, situated, and distributed in the leftmost column. And the first column after that, right in the middle, is what we know from Western ways of knowing, of measuring. And these are findings from neuroscience, cognitive science, and educational psychology, among others. So for embodied cognition, of course, we think about the role of our senses and movement in thinking. Situated cognition is about the influence of place and space on learning and thinking. And distributed is about learning from and with others. So that comes from our Western way of knowing. But what I want to point out is this overlap or convergence of understanding from Indigenous ways of knowing. And so embodied cognition in Indigenous ways of knowing, across millennia, they have emphasized sensory motor systems in how we learn and know information. And sensory, of course, is about our five senses, and motor relates to movement. Situated cognition, according to Indigenous ways of knowing, is about all beings and the land being connected and relying on one another and also working in balance. Finally, we have distributed cognition. And Indigenous perspectives tell us that community, reciprocity, and intergenerational relationships are important ways of knowing. So I'm hoping that this helps you to see this convergence of perspectives that we're developing today based on the extended mind and recognizing Indigenous ways of knowing. And really, it's complex. So rather than thinking of binary and separate concepts and ways of looking at things, we really do have to acknowledge the complexity. And that's the excitement that I feel today about this frontier where we stand. And that's recognizing those three cognitions and also the complexity that they help us to think about and the frontier that we stand today. So we want to think about how we learn beyond binary notions of knowing and learning and into complex understanding instead. So today, the frontier where we stand is about extending and converging ways of knowing that are both subconscious and conscious learning, Western and Indigenous ways of knowing, and these disciplines of educational psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science. So these are all finally coming together today. And that's where you and I stand together to continually deepen our knowledge and understanding. So to go even deeper, I want to give you this metaphor about where we stand today in this notion of convergence. And it really has me thinking about water and the rivers and how really, as we learn, the water deepens and we get more and more tributaries contributing to our learning across the lifespan. So the 5 Great Lakes actually empty into the St. Lawrence River, but they converge at this spot here, Niagara Falls. And this is where I feel we are today. We've got Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. We have the different disciplines of neuroscience, cognitive science, and educational psychology. And today, with the extended mind, we're converging at this Niagara Falls-like experience. And truly, this monumental rush of knowledge and understanding by coming together and recognizing these different perspectives and ways of knowing is represented in this gorgeous water flow of the Niagara Falls area. And if you haven't visited, I highly recommend it. So to help you go deeper, finally, I want to highly recommend Annie Murphy Paul's book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. In addition to that, I highly recommend, especially if you're an educator, this in-action book, The Extended Mind by Emma Turner, David Goodwin, and Oliver Caviglioli. I can't emphasize enough how practical and concrete the notions that they describe related to the extended mind can be for all of us. And finally, I'm going to share with you my references. Here you go. So thank you for engaging actively in this video, and I will see you online.